Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending the 2020 Sunstone Digital Symposium Session 265, titled, How is the Church Really Doing? Some Uncorrelated Statistics. The audio from this session will be available for purchase at sunstone.org after the symposium. The video recording of this session will be available in the Whova app for the remainder of 2020. Please type your questions into the Whova app to be addressed during the question and answer period. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There's more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. About this presentation. The LDS Church releases loads of statistics, and they imply many more. This is a brief and possibly entertaining look at the LDS Church's demographic profile and how it may need to change in order to meet future demands. Information is drawn from official reports and almanacs. Comparisons will be made with other churches and even the early Christian church. We can't see the future, but history and statistics might help us see its outlines. I'll take a second to introduce our speaker. Brian Simper is a family history consultant in his Arizona ward when he is not asking uncomfortable questions in gospel doctrine. Most of his time is spent as a network security engineer where he builds controls that protect online banking. He is married to a wife who loves family history research. They have 4 children, a daughter-in-law, and a freeloading cat. Welcome, Brian.
Hello. Okay, let's get this started. Okay, you'll let me know if you're not looking at the right thing. This is Uncorrelated Statistics Report. I am Brian Simper. I'm a network security engineer. I examine web traffic, and most people's is appalling. I'm married to Shanda Richens. We have 4 children, and the cat came from my in-laws when they went on their mission to Nauvoo, and it's still here, but they are home. That's okay. He's a nice cat. Let's do a quick thought experiment on temple work in the millennium. LDS doctrine states that we will be spending the millennium doing temple work for all the people who never got a chance to be baptized or taught here on earth. We were told the temples would need to be running night and day to accomplish all that temple work for every descendant of Adam and Eve who ever walked this planet. While we would have God's assistance in getting names and dates, it would still fall to mortals to do this work. What would the schedule look like? Would there even be enough time within 1,000 years? There have been an estimated 100 billion humans to ever live on the earth. That's a lot of endowment sessions. Let's make this more difficult by pretending that only a measly 1 million righteous people are left on earth after the second coming. Who knows what major sins led to that drastic reduction of people? It would be a daunting task. However, they have 1,000 years to do this for 100 billion people. That means that each year we would need 100 million baptisms, ordinations, initiatories, endowments, and sealings to spouse, parents, and children each year. Still looks challenging. Still, it means that each of those 1 million righteous left behind saints have to do the saving ordinance of just 100 people each year. And there are 52 weeks in a year. So each person would need to do 2 per week, and I would still get 2 weeks off for Christmas. Maybe we'll just do 1 complete set of ordinances on Monday, then another on Tuesday. You could probably be done by lunch. And you still have 5 more days per week to fill. That's not a bad schedule if you don't have to hold down a full-time job. It's an easily accomplished goal based on only low numbers of righteous people. I came up with this during a boring Elders Quorum lesson, and I quickly lost all fear of any imagined temple grind in the millennium. And this is based on 100 billion people total and only 1 million to do the work. I hope we can also assume this is a laughably low number, even from the most conservative estimate from an apostle trying to get us to keep the commandments. This is some of the both fun and horror of playing with demographic statistics. I was a ward clerk for several years and counted sacrament meeting attendance each week. This was my tiny part of informing Salt Lake City of how many people were sitting in sacrament meeting. Weekly attendance would eventually lead to tithing, missions, and temple marriage, thus producing the next generation of children who will messily eat Cheerios during sacrament meeting. As political columnist Mark Stein writes, the future belongs to those who will show up. This certainly applies to church. I have no connection whatsoever to the statistics department of the LDS Church. I'm simply a board engineer with a spreadsheet. We're going to look at published numbers, and we will, for now, simply accept that those numbers are as accurate as they can produce. These will all be factors that relate to the growth of the LDS Church. Please also note that I'm not trying to tear down the church. If the strength of the LDS Church is to be found in members, then knowing how many will show up is important. My household budgeting works with money that shows up in my account for my spending needs. Similarly, the LDS Church has to know how many righteous souls will show up to be mission presidents and missionaries, along with bishops and primary teachers. The worth of a soul continues to be great. Those diligent ward clerks send in quarterly reports and have those numbers examined by planning committees, 70s, and apostles. These numbers are used to place new buildings, new missions, and break ground for new temples. None of this presentation will be to claim that the LDS Church is either true or false. That's a spiritual proposition that will remain outside the scope of this presentation. It is only the observation that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a valid interest in its own organizational longevity. It's no advantage of any faith system to try and please absolutely everyone. The LDS Church is simply trying to take a path that leads to its own future viability. Rodney Stark was a sociologist. In 1984, he produced an essay entitled The Rise of a New World Faith. He made the following observation: if growth during the next century is like that of the past, the Mormons will become a major world faith. If, for example, we assume they will grow by 30% per decade, then in 2080, there will be more than 60 million Mormons. But since World War II, the Mormon growth rate has been far higher than 30% per decade. If we set the growth rate at 50%, then in 2080, there will be 250 million Mormons. Dr. Rodney Stark still writes and teaches at Baylor University today. The growth as reported is a little behind what Dr. Stark would have predicted. There are lots of reasons for this, many of which will be discussed at Sunstone. But I can't fault Dr. Stark's math at the time. He simply assumed that the growth rate would remain high due to missionary work and family size. He also did not see forces on the church that resulted in, say, the new gospel topic essays or other challenges they're facing. However, many LDS leaders were truly excited by Dr. Stark's theorized growth rate, including my high school seminary teacher. In my class, he would casually talk about Mormons being a much larger slice of the pie chart when showing various Christian denominations. He did not like being stuck inside that tiny 1% slice. While the Roman Catholics would continue to be the largest slice, we would have eclipsed the Eastern Orthodox Catholics. It was a heady time to be an LDS missionary, particularly if you were serving in Latin America. But that growth did not quite continue. It certainly made the annual General Conference statistics report more interesting to people like me. I was a bit dismayed when they stopped reading it live during the Sunday afternoon session. Saturday afternoon, actually. So far, it still gets published the first weekend of April. I can only hope that this continues. Of course, we only get a few general data points and no trending gets announced. There are other stats I wish they released that would simply be the aggregate statistics of what I was sending in for quarterly reports. These include sacrament meeting attendance, youth, primary, temple recommend holders, temple attendance demographics, tithing and fast offering numbers would be really great. I know they have these numbers in great detail because I had my ward's version in great detail and I was reporting them each quarter as a clerk. But anyone can just look at the May ensign each year since 1972 and pull out some of that data. Just go year by year and put it in a spreadsheet, which is how I started doing it. It only takes about half an hour. I'm not the first person to try this, and it's very interesting what you can learn. On the left is the total membership of the church rising much like Dr. Stark predicted. On the right, we have the annual growth rate of the LDS Church, which is a statistic that is easy to compute. It's just the difference between membership from last year to this year divided by a baseline of last year. It makes a line that meanders up and down in a jagged pattern. The percent change is shown on the right. We could look at the annual growth rate over time and do some curve fitting to possibly predict the growth in the future. But this technique proves to be wildly incorrect when we try it on historical data. While the growth has been good, it has been slowing after a flurry of activity in the 1980s. Instead, this is why I like looking at the average size of a ward. This is simply calculating the number of members per congregation in the church.
Excuse me, Brian, can
Yes.
I interrupt you for just a minute? Are you, do you have a slide that goes along with what you're talking about? What we're seeing is just your opening slide that says Uncorrelated Statistics Report.
Seriously? I am on annual growth rate. I don't know why it's still showing that. That is really strange. Let me stop sharing and try resharing.
Okay.
Let's see. All right, does this look?
There we go. Much better, thank you.
Well, that's disappointing. Nevertheless, let's continue on. All right, so this is an estimate of how many people should be in your average sacrament meeting each Sunday. Both total membership and total units are announced each April, and this is the first calculation I do each year. The church could inflate or deflate the size of wards to reflect this, but it's really difficult to do in practice. You have to staff a ward with a certain number of priesthood holders, many of which are required to be married. As a result, while I wish this data was broken out more, it still reveals a practical measure of LDS growth and activity and inactivity. In 1980, it was 368 people per ward or branch. That would be a solid number, and if weekly attendance were that high, it would likely prompt a ward split in that crowded chapel. By 1990, it was 429 per unit. Gordon Hinckley was known to have told the apostles and membership that retention is a critical problem, and these numbers start to really show it, as in 2000 when it was 427 people per ward, only down slightly during the 90s decade. President Hinckley certainly had retention as a priority. By 2000, we should have been jam-packed into sacrament meeting with 493 per congregation. This topped out at 535 for 2019. Remember, this does not just apply to big wards in Utah and Idaho. This is the average membership per unit, which also includes tiny branches in Africa and wards with historically high inactivity in Latin America. So, where is everyone? The inactivity can be observed simply by looking at common American wards with 200 plus people in sacrament meeting, and then wondering where the other 335 are spending their Sabbath. We have to at least note obvious changes in reporting methods. The numbers in the 70s were all rounded to 1,000. Some years they reported births, and some years they reported baptisms of 8-year-olds. Wards and branches were reported separately until 1980. The baptism of 8-year-olds stopped being reported in 96. But this is also a clear sign of inactivity church-wide. It's the kind of thing that missionaries and Latin Americans have known about for a long time. The church keeps a lot of people on its rolls that it probably should not keep. I do not doubt the good intention of leaders who want to keep people's names and ordinances listed with the church they believe has all the keys of salvation. But this kind of attendance imbalance is a natural result of trying to keep everyone on the attendance rolls, no matter how little attention they would pay towards a church. As you know, many people even resort to filing paperwork with a lawyer to remove themselves from the church. This imbalance in inactivity and people on the attendance rolls becomes starker when we again look at total membership along with convert baptisms and births. These three numbers are released with the annual statistical report, although the increase in children of record was not always reported before 1997. We're going to see some statistical and record-keeping weirdness. This year's membership minus last year's membership is the membership increase. That's easy enough. Let's add convert baptisms to new children of record. This shows how many people are entering the church. We'll call this incoming members. I'm obviously not aware of any other ways to become a member of a church except by conversion or birth. Now, membership increase and incoming members are not the same number because they count different things. The difference is people exiting the church. This is not the count of people angrily resigning and going apostate. Because we don't have a cure for the common birthday, so many of these exits are members of the church dying of all the normal, non-suspicious reasons here in mortality. So we're not going to do a lot of math, don't worry, there will be no quiz, but let's look at the year 2000 where we had an almost 316,000 membership increase and 355,000 children and converts. That means that 39,000 people exited the LDS Church. Again, this is people who died under all circumstances, in addition to apostates who just want to drink coffee and sleep late on Sunday. Apostates and some of those Sunstone attendees are in there somewhere. We'll call this exiting members. We have to contend with a couple of anomalies that showed up. In 1999, we had a solid 398,000 person increase in membership. We only had 390,000 children plus converts. Based on those numbers, the total growth of the church was more than the people who were baptized and the babies born. So around 8,400 people joined the company of saints through some unknown means. We're not going to get good answers for this weirdness. I chalk it up to changes in reporting standards that have not remained consistent. Virtually every field of science runs into this problem eventually. But we are left with a couple of other unusual trends. The exiting membership numbers on the right go up steadily in the 90s and 2000s, up to nearly 100,000 per year. But then something weird happens in 2012 when exiting members cuts in half down to 53,000. That's only a brief dip, as exiting members shoot up to 122,000 in 2014. This burst stays above 100K for the next few years before dipping down to 91,000 based on 2019 reports. I don't have a full explanation for these numbers. It's not random enough to be chaos, and it's not organized enough to be planned. But if you were at church headquarters on the planning committee or the records committee, these trends are worth examining. Listing the increase in the children of record makes it easier to calculate a measure called the crude birth rate. Demographers define this as the number of children born per year per 1,000 people. It's only called crude because that 1,000 people also contains underage children, the elderly, and about half of them is men, a demographic not known for birthing children. The crude birth rate is calculated using membership divided by new children of record. Adoptions might also show up here, as well as young children of converts, but it's mostly babies that get blessed in sacrament meeting. We get some curious peaks and valleys in the graph of the crude birth rate. It was 7.36 in 2000 and had gone as high as 9.14 in 2008, but it was below 7 since 2016 and is down to 5.69 as of 2019. The real paradox comes from finding that the crude birth rate for the entire planet is 18.5. Africa and less developed parts of Asia are the overachievers here, but the crude birth rate is 12.5 for the United States. This doesn't make any sense. Mormons are known for larger families, so where did the babies go? The biggest answer I can find is that inactive members are having them and then not reporting them to the local ward they have never attended. I have some close friends who are definitely in that group. All the active weekly attending Mormons are certainly bringing their infants to church. And spoiler alert, Pew Research Center will have much more to say on this subject later in this presentation. The statistical report does imply a more accurate number of the crude birth rate and, as we will see, the activity rate. We already noted that we should be seeing 535 people for congregation if every person on the attendance roll actually showed up for sacrament meeting. This idea is, of course, complicated by the near complete inactivity of 2020's pandemic attendance. But think of the last time you attended a complete sacrament meeting, whether it was back in March or much, much longer ago. My parents' ward in rural Arizona has around 100 for sacrament meeting, and my big Phoenix area ward is about 250. We had as high as 330 during an especially popular farewell. I've seen 400 or 500 in the week a large ward was split. I know that smaller branches might only have a dozen attending. The church is not going to hand over these numbers, unfortunately, but let's make a really crazy assumption that the actual average attendance is around 200. It makes the math easy, but this is just a gut reaction, a guess. And it's based on me observing the crowds at sacrament meeting after decades of attending church. It would be a comfortable number in a sacrament meeting. Our chapels are usually built for that number. We know the number of wards and branches. 200 is a number more like it reflects practical experience. So let's multiply wards and branches by 200 and see what we get. With the completely wild guess of 200 people per week, per ward or branch, on average, that means that in 2000, there were just over 5 million active Mormons. As of 2019, that number is just over 6 million because there were just over 30,000 wards and branches. This is just my conjecture so far. This is not a rigorous analysis, but these 6 million people are the families that bless their babies in church and faithfully record their names with church headquarters. It may still be a high guess. Let's see the crude birth rate based on these assumed attendance numbers and the known new children of record. There were 81,000 new children of record reported in 2000 and 94,000 in 2019. This puts the LDS Church at a crude birth rate of about 15. That got as high as 21 from the years 2008 to 2012, when a large number of babies were recorded. A crude birth rate of 15 is certainly higher than the US national crude birth rate of 12. These numbers are still a rough guess, but that estimate of 200 people attending per week per congregation is probably closer to accurate numbers than 535. Based on those calculations and a reported 16 million members, the LDS Church appears to have an activity rate no higher than 37% and possibly lower. This is not a definitive model, but it certainly looks closer to the lived experience of your average ward in the Western world. If you want to still follow the growth forecast of Dr. Rodney Stark, then applying this limiting percentage will likely be more accurate. So let's change gears and compare the LDS growth rate to other faiths. The first comparison ought to be with Christianity itself in the first centuries. Acts chapter 2 records 3,000 baptisms shortly after Pentecost. It's a good start. There were an estimated 10,000 Christians around 100 AD. The error bars on this number are very large, of course. The number was up to 200,000 at 200 AD at the end of Pax Romana. By 250, the number is estimated at 1 million at the height of the crisis of the 3rd century, where the Roman Empire had about 50 years of civil war. The upside was that Christianity was allowed to flourish without official suppression from the central government. Roman leaders were too busy putting down rebellions and fighting amongst themselves. This from about 240 to 281. And this led to an estimated population of 6 million Christians in 300 AD. I think we can be impressed at a faith that grew so dramatically over those 50 years. It's a testament to their evangelizing spirit and the size of Christian families in those times. One of the less savory cultural practices of Rome was abandoning unwanted infants to the elements. Christians often organized to roam the streets late in the evening looking for abandoned children. These foundlings were adopted into Christian families. That's certainly one way to grow a church. The 4th century was a good one for Christianity, as Constantine made it legally allowed and Theodosius made it officially preferred, and the estimated growth curve goes up quickly from there. The LDS Church might take some pride in greater numbers than the early Christian church at their 2-century mark. The Christianity of Irenaeus and Justin Martyr was about 0.1% of an estimated world population of 195 million. That is not as large as the 0.2% that the LDS Church appears out of a world population of nearly 8 billion. Christian apologists have touted the impressive growth of Christianity during those centuries. Mouthy skeptics have pointed out the LDS Church grew at similar rates, which does not bring happy agreement to your average evangelical. Besides, we only have to look at another Restoration era faith that has had numerically greater growth. 1844 was a big year for Restoration churches in the United States. The Seventh-day Adventist Church arose out of followers of William Miller. Miller, of course, predicted the second coming of Jesus in October of 1844 and was apparently wrong. From that disappointed congregation, the Adventists formally started in 1863 with 3,000 people. Brigham Young had more than 60,000 followers at that point. Today, the Seventh-day Adventists have more than 21 million members on their rolls. As they announce, they are doing well in Africa, and I'll bet that LDS leadership has been examining their operation. With their 21 million members, they have over 161,000 congregations for an average of 132 members per unit. Another major restorationist faith is the Jehovah's Witnesses. They started in 1870 and reported 8.7 million adherents in the most recent year. They also have 119,000 congregations, putting them at an average of barely 72 people per congregation. I'm not saying they're doing things either right or wrong. Instead, they are doing things differently. This creates their own specific dynamics for retention and attendance. I have to note that the Jehovah's Witnesses reported more than 20 million that attended their worldwide memorial event in 2019, but this includes non-evangelizing members and investigators. We could go on with growth and size of many different denominations, and we will look at a few more. To be fair, my presentation was also not scrutinizing the activity rate of Adventists or witnesses. This is the growth rate of the LDS Church based on published numbers. It's probably a bit high even as the growth rate slows. Still, we ought to ask why these numbers are actually important at all. The LDS Church is one of the most publicly missionary-minded faiths around, as the Book of Mormon musical comprehends. Officially, the LDS Church states that it is the one true church with exclusive authority to perform the ordinance of salvation. To be fair, a lot of other faiths feel similarly about themselves. For faiths to proclaim that they provide this level of salvation, it is an axiomatic good thing that they grow. It's easy to find believers who think that the whole world getting baptized into their one favorite church would be a great thing. I'm related to several. But we're not looking at either the ethics or doctrinal support of trying to convert the world today. Instead, we can certainly look at the effectiveness of those efforts based on the released numbers. In 1980, there were 221,000 converts and 30,000 full-time missionaries. There's about 7.38 baptisms per missionary that year. Since this is by individual missionary, a companionship could expect just over 1 month per baptism per month on average. I can already imagine the missionaries in Latin America thinking those are rookie numbers, while my friends in Northern Europe are feeling either guilt or disappointment. The released statistics put 1989 as the high point in missionary work with 8.03 baptisms per missionary. That was the year of the single greatest number of recorded converts in LDS history, with 318,940 baptisms. I was involved with 3 of them. But this went into a steady decline at the end of the 20th century, down to 4.32 converts by 2003. There was a small improvement by 2010, and an average of 3.71 converts per full-time missionary by the 2019 report released in April. Well, let's flip that equation upside down, and we have a measure of the number of months each full-time missionary spends to get a single convert. We have full-time missionaries sitting in their apartment right now looking for that convert. I certainly never enjoyed tracting, but I think I would have preferred it over being stuck in an apartment in 2020. And this is about what I experienced on my mission in Canada in the late 1980s. I got a baptism about every other month, with a few months with more than one and a few dry spells in between. This does not reflect on just how many personal human contacts any missionary has to attempt to find that one person every few months. Overall, baptisms show up a bit less than quarterly since 2013. I will note that the worth of souls is great in D&C 18. The cost is going up, and each of those full-time missionaries is paying to be there. In 1991, the church normalized the cost of missions to be $350 per month per missionary. This was increased to $400 in 2003 and changed to $500 per month just starting in July this year. The cost normalization was probably welcome in most families. My family did have some good friends who sent us on to Switzerland to the tune of $600 per month. It was known that LDS parents used to quietly hope or pray that their children would end up in some place in South America or Micronesia for much, much less. I was in Canada for $300 per month. Let's just normalize the cost per month of a mission at $300 before it was equalized in 1991. I know there are other costs with the mission office, mission president, and how the LDS Church pays for travel to and from each mission. But the published monthly cost is what individual LDS families are willingly paying. As always, these are directly from numbers publicly released from the church. The cost of one baptism is based on how many full-time months it takes for one missionary to get that one baptism. That puts the cost of one convert in 1980 at $487. By 1989, the cost of one baptism dropped slightly to $448 as the baptism rate rose faster than the number of full-time missionaries. In 2000, we had the cost rise to $931, and 2003, it went above $1,000 for the first time. It dipped down to $886 in 2009, but was back up above $1,000 per month from 2012 onward. The biggest jump was in 2013 as the mission age was lowered, bringing in a bunch of new missionaries, but not a similar increase in converts. The cost per baptism rose to $1,400. This has not dropped dramatically since then, with a cost at $1,292 as of last year. Not to put too fine a point on it, but this is the worth of a soul if you're dealing only with accountancy. The change from $487 in 1980 to $1,292 in 2019 is inflation, and it's an increase of 2.65. The U.S. Consumer Price Index over the same period is 2.57, so the worth of a soul has inflated about the same rate as other consumer goods. These are costs paid by thousands of LDS families for young and elderly full-time missionaries. Multiply the number of missionaries times the cost per month and 12 months in a year, and we get an annual amount of money that makes the assets held by Ensign Peak look believable. I also need to reiterate that this is not from some leak or inside information. I just multiplied the numbers they handed out publicly. Let's be fair and note that the money is paid by parents, family, and friends to the LDS Church's offerings. We don't know the budget of the missionary department itself. Instead, the faithful missionary families willingly spent $321 million on supporting 67,000 missionaries last year. These are large numbers, but it's an annual amount, and the church spends it almost immediately on food, clothing, shelter, and travel for 67,000 missionaries. This is above and beyond tithing and fast offerings, as your ward financial clerk could easily tell you. I also note that the LDS Church does directly support missionaries that go out when they come from poor countries. We do not have the breakdown of where each missionary comes from and how many missionaries are fully supported by their families. It's also a clear view of the priorities of the LDS Church. Even if they think the church might better serve the world by putting this money elsewhere, they can easily state that they are following the Great Commission of Jesus in Matthew 28, to go ye therefore and teach all nations. The LDS Church could easily ask why this small American church has this extensive missionary program. Nothing is stopping any other Christian denomination from doing this, but it's usually just the Mormons and the Jehovah's Witnesses that you see knocking on doors. Well, that's a lot of numbers to take in, and again, there will not be a quiz. The church does not publish exact statistics on the percentage of youth that go on missions. In 1992, they did publicly state that 32% of young men ended up serving missions for the church. We do not have firm statistics since then. The church does want its youth to be on the path of mission, marriage, and children. As I left on my mission, my father told me that the most important conversion he had was of himself. There's good reason that the institutional church wholeheartedly would agree. This is where the ranks of future leaders come from. Although not necessarily going on a mission is, if you don't go on one, it's not a deal breaker. I have to mention that President Monson, President Nelson, Elder Oaks, and Elder Eyring all did not serve a mission as youth, and look where they are now. Still, this cultural rite of passage for LDS youth continues to intrigue other Christian denominations. This is likely one of the key drivers of LDS retention in the critical years between high school graduation and family formation. Lowering the ages for missionaries in October 2013 made one significant, and I think rather underreported, change to LDS culture. Lowering the age for women to go on a mission changes the dynamics of what leads a woman to make this commitment. Before 2013, one driver of women going on a mission was whether or not they were married. This is kind of insulting, but it's an all too common assumption for women missionaries before 2013. In the next Mormon survey, Jana Reese noted a positive increase in millennials entering missionary service and a sizable increase in young women since 2013. Now women can go at 19, and this makes missionary service into something that more young women simply plan to do before college or after their freshman year. I don't know if this was a goal of that age change, but I think it was a welcome outcome for many young women and their families. For Christmas 2013, I was in New Mexico with my family, spending the holidays at my in-laws' house. One evening, we had the ward elders over for dinner. This was just 2 months after the announcement of the age change was made, but many 18-year-old men and 19-year-old women had put in their papers, and now some of them were in the Farmington, New Mexico mission. The two ward elders were both 20 years old from the former age policy. I asked them how these new rookie missionaries were working out coming from a younger crowd. One of them sighed and said, "Those younger missionaries sure do seem to take a shine to each other." Who would have guessed what would happen if you put 18-year-old men and 19-year-old women together in emotionally and spiritually charged situations? I have a hypothesis that this is a feature and not a bug of the age reduction policy. There is no way for me to prove this, but I suspect that the missionary department is not entirely worried about the increased fraternization. This is because it will lead to more LDS temple marriages between young men and young women who met on their mission. The attendant hormonal situations in a mission may be a small price to pay for this increased devotion. All of this is related to how a church grows. Maintaining devotion and testimony is critical for any faith that wants to remain relevant. Let's examine denomination growth for other faiths in the United States. The Pew Research Center published a fascinating report of religious composition of adults in 2015. This is based on percentages on the numbers you see and not on absolute counts. The percentage change does not necessarily mean a drop in membership of a group, but the United States did grow larger over those 7 years. Any group that increased their percentage was going to be larger in an absolute sense and was growing faster than the population of the United States. The big headline that was commonly pulled from the report was the unaffiliated group that went from 16% to almost 23%. This was embraced quite happily by my friends in the atheist camp in the United States. I think they declared impending victory a bit early. That category was only a few percentage points of atheists and agnostics. The nothing particular label was a vast majority of the unaffiliated. Muslims and Hindus had impressive growth. Immigration was a factor. Even the Jehovah's Witnesses went up. Catholics, Protestants, and pretty much everyone else was down, including the LDS Church. This is overall a really interesting report. You will not regret downloading a copy and looking through it. I could have done several presentations on the major themes. But it's not just American Christianity working through growth issues. Sunday Assembly was founded in 2013 in Great Britain. This was an entirely secular church designed to provide a religious style community for the group known as the Nuns. A 2013 Daily Beast article referred to Sunday Assembly as the hot new atheist church. This has worked pretty well for a few years with 70 chapters and 5,000 monthly attendees in 2016, but this was down to 40 chapters and 3,500 weekly attendees in 2018. Leaders in Sunday Assembly have noted that it's a lot of hard work to maintain a church, which any person in an LDS church could tell you about in a ward. These are not easy groups to form, and there are many experiments trying to make this work. Other groups like the Oasis Network in the United States are doing something similar. And we can also note that religious churches have thousands of years of experience putting people together with sustainable expectations. I'm certainly not denouncing groups like this. I certainly have to mention the Toronto Center Place church that John Hamer established. He gave a presentation about growth of the Center Place at the 2019 Sunstone Conference, showing some real sustained growth. I am watching it as a viable model for a liberal church that offers community for congregants across a wide spectrum of belief. They have a great YouTube channel. I think one advantage they have is that the Toronto congregation is affiliated with Community of Christ Canada. That framework may be part of the group's sustainability. Being a secular group does not guarantee failure, and being religious does not guarantee success. The Shakers were founded by James and Jane Wardley in England. They were widely influential to wider Christianity with ideas, hymns, and communal living, and even novel farming practices. They believed in pacifism and equality of the sexes, which would make them difficult to classify on the liberal and conservative spectrum. But they also practiced celibacy, so a report on increased children of record would not be a significant part of their annual report. They did surprisingly well for themselves, but are defunct at this point. The future does not belong to you if you don't show up. The Oneida community had a virtually opposite view on celibacy. It was another utopian group that arose in a similar time and place around the LDS Church. Their utopian ideas were similar to the Shakers with communal living, but sexual union was an important part of their beliefs. This was not monogamy. It was much more complex than any arrangements that Joseph Smith or Brigham Young established. Every woman was the wife of every man, and every man was the husband of every wife in the community. By 1879, the surrounding communities had become quite hostile to this perfectionist marriage arrangement. Noyes and a few adherents went to Canada, where he passed away in 1886. The remaining members set up a joint stock company known as Oneida Community Limited, which still exists today, making silverware and other items. We have already referred to the Pew Research Center in their 2015 report. Frankly, they do a much more thorough job than I have. They produced America's Changing Religious Landscape, and the subheading is Christians Decline Sharply as a Share of Population. Unaffiliated other faiths continue to grow. However, it was intriguing to see how much text was devoted to the LDS Church. While we are only 1.6% of the adult religious observance in the United States, we got a lot more coverage. On page 64 of the full report, there is a table showing one of the starkest metrics on how the LDS Church is doing. This is the fertility and child rearing table showing a metric of completed fertility. This is defined as the average number of children ever born to adults aged 40 to 59. We previously talked about the crude birth rate, and this is a much more precise version of that. You can see in the table that Mormons prominently stand out with an average of 3.4 children per adult. They also had the highest number of children living at home. These are the kids that populate primary and eat Cheerios and sacrament meeting. The second highest number is 2.5 for women in historically Black Christian churches. For a population to remain stable, there needs to be a lifetime average of 2.1 children born per woman. This is a baseline amount that takes into account childhood mortality that is luckily less of a danger in modern life. Roman Catholics and evangelical Christians are barely above that 2.1 base replacement rate, and the mainline Protestant churches are simply below it. We also have to note that atheists, agnostics, and nothing particular group are solidly below 2. Presumably, a nation full of non-believers would simply go into absolute population decline. Positive overall growth of the nones would be dependent on proselyting and converting from the believers. They would have to rely on religious immigration if they wanted a stable economy and social structure. For the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a total fertility rate of 3.4 is effectively why the LDS Church has not gone into decline. They have a growth rate that quietly makes up for many of their losses. There are lots of forces acting on the membership of the LDS Church. It's not hard to go on the ex-Mormon subreddit and see people wondering what the next scandal will be, and lament on why any previous scandal has not caused the LDS Church to falter in a dramatic way. Of course, this is a serious misunderstanding of how religious beliefs work. CES letter certainly tries to convince faithful Mormons to reconsider, but plenty of posts on your average unbelieving forum are people lamenting that this information has not affected their friends and family in the same way. We will leave that discussion for plenty of other Sunstone presentations. For our purposes, the not-so-secret weapon of the LDS Church is their fanatical devotion to families. This was not intended to sound like a marketing pitch for the church, but how often have each of you seen a large family group portrait in the home of a believing Mormon? It shows grandparents surrounded by adult children and a dozen or more grandchildren in the picture. You've seen this picture plenty of times. Many of you have such a picture in your own home. And no kidding, this is mine. That's what a fertility rate of 3.4 will cause to happen. The 20th century baby boom never really stopped in Utah. This is part of the reason that early Christians in the Roman Empire grew like they did. Their God started out as a baby, not as a lightning bolt throwing conqueror. Jesus revered his mother and his father and had siblings like James. He's noted to have a couple of sisters. He had cousins like John the Baptist. Imagine his Sabbath afternoon family dinners. The dying mortal words of Jesus on the cross were for someone to take care of his mother. This set an attitude and culture towards family and church that certainly attracted the poor and downtrodden in the early years of Christianity. And let's note that it's not just Mormons who might have this trait. Conservative evangelical families will be like this. Large Catholic families exist for similar reasons. I can only imagine debates about the ban on birth control that Catholics continue to have. These families are an important core of a church. Okay, remember a few years ago when Mormon Leaks released that slide showing threats to the church from different left and right leaning influences? I will certainly give credit for John DeLynn for getting his name in a bubble, but Denver Snuffer got his name there also. John DeLynn's excellent work in Mormon stories is towards a more progressive Mormonism, and Denver Snuffer's remnant group leads a bit more in the conservative direction. Our friends in the fundamentalist community may not have warranted a bubble, but they are further right. If the LDS Church moves in a progressive, liberal direction, they risk angering the conservatives and the Orthodox. If the church moves in a more conservative direction, then they tick off the liberals. Now, which direction do you think that the majority of faithful Latter-day Saints tend to lean? Please note that I'm not at all making a statement about righteousness. I'm only talking about those men who tend to become hard-working bishops and women who end up as Great Relief Society presidents. These are the people doing all the work in your wards and stakes. They are not universally conservative, but it's clear where they lean. They are people fulfilling high-demand callings, sending children on missions, going on senior missions, and paying tithing. They are more likely to be keeping up that 3.4 total fertility rate. Yes, there are many progressives doing these things, but not in as large of numbers. LDS leadership has a difficult balancing act to maintain. They prefer to keep everyone happy, but that's not always possible. If they have to choose one way or the other to lean, they will tend towards keeping the conservatives happy, often at the expense of the liberals. You can complain about it all you want. You can point out the conservatives who lost faith in the LDS Church, but you can also see the kind of people fulfilling the most challenging jobs in a ward and what kind of men enter senior leadership. Again, I don't have any inside knowledge of discussion within LDS leadership. I can only imagine that apostles have seen demographic statistics and the 2015 Pew Research Center report. You could oppose LDS leadership all you want, but they have made their choice in the direction that most supports families that take their 3.4 children with them to church. If there was a proposal that would reduce this number, would anyone in leadership want to embrace that policy? There are plenty of calls for liberalization of many points of LDS culture and doctrine. The LGBT experience is a deeply challenging and divisive issue. The issue of ordaining women is similarly difficult. The release of the new gospel topic essays is known to have been hotly debated in LDS leadership. After 1978, there were a few wards that actually sent representatives to Salt Lake City to oppose the ordination of men of African descent. Would liberalization produce a flurry of new growth in the LDS Church? I don't have a crystal ball or seer stone for answering that kind of question. We can, however, look at similar churches that did run that experiment. Perhaps the easiest example are our friends in Community of Christ. I'm sure that everyone in this audience knows that Community of Christ used to be the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, founded by Emma and Joseph Smith III. This is Wallace B. Smith, Joseph Smith's great-grandson and the prophet president of the Reorganized Church in the 1980s. He is retired, but he is still alive today. In 1984, he decreed the construction of the Independence Temple and the ordination of women to the priesthood. This was more than a bit controversial, but I grant that this is not unlike his famous great-grandfather. Between the mid-1960s and the late 1990s, there was a one-third decline in new baptisms in the United States, along with a 50% drop in contributions in the decade before 1998. This led to breakaway churches, including the Remnant Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The name change to Community of Christ happened in 2001. By 2013, the church universally allowed same-sex marriages and ordination of LGBT members. Community of Christ attracts a lot of ex-LDS members. I'm not saying they were wrong. This could turn out to be a profoundly good move in the long term. I'm only noting that Community of Christ took a very different and deliberate path than the Russell M. Nelson's favorite church. The demographics between the two groups have diverged. In spite of the clear numerical challenges experienced by the LDS Church, they persist with family formation. The future trends of this, based on Mormons born in the 21st century, will be fascinating to watch. This is certainly venturing out of the area of numbers, demographics, and trends. I am pointing out the correlation between liberal theology and demographic decline. I cannot firmly establish the causation for you, but it's not me that needs to be convinced one way or the other. It's the 15 men who claim the title of apostle in the LDS Church that you would need to convince. The church changes very slowly until almost unexpectedly it changes quickly. The temple endowment changed last week, and virtually no one can yet comment on those changes, including me. The point of all this discussion is not to convince either LGBT advocates or ordained women to give up on their ideals. I would point out simply standing on the righteousness or logic or mercy of their cause is not enough. So if you want to change something in the LDS Church, try putting your change in terms of how it will positively affect families and family formation. Put your change in terms of how it will encourage young men and young women to have children. Demonstrate that a progressive church will have growth over more than just the short term. I pointed out a bunch of quiet demographic challenges under the surface of LDS culture. Will your cause improve any of those metrics? This is also not necessarily to assure my stalwart friends that simply staying the course in their conservative beliefs and culture is the right thing to do. The overall trends are troubling at best. I'm simply pointing out how little incentive the LDS Church has for changing the way they operate. My dear lesbian daughter and her wife first met in seminary, in high school. They are profoundly unlikely to ever come back to church. What does it possibly offer to them? This is another simple and common cultural complaint against the LDS Church. The focus of lessons for young men and young women is a regular point of contention in stories of faith transition. Young women get loads of lessons on marriage, almost to the exclusion of career and education. Young men are taught to go on a mission and then get married. This is further bolstered by lessons to both groups about chastity. This leads to younger marriages. Arguably, it leads to many marriages between partners that are probably not entirely compatible. The dynamics of mixed faith marriages after faith transition is really difficult. This near single-minded emphasis on faithful generational families also leads to a culture that highly values being married and having children. It leads to having larger families and demographic growth. It leads to noisy sacrament meetings today and a sharply increased chance for sacrament meetings to still be held in 20 years. This is running into trends of people leaving the church. I do not know which trend will be bigger. This is not a call for moral support or opposition to current LDS doctrine or practice. It's a recognition that if a group is agitating for change, they need to express how their preferred change will not adversely affect what the LDS Church already has going for them. In the parable of the lost sheep, the good shepherd leaves the 99, goes after the one that is lost. The problem the LDS Church seems to be having today is that policies to convince the lost to come back may convince more of the 99 to also get lost. The experiment in liberalization continues, and clear results might not be evident for another generation or two. Community of Christ made the difficult and deliberate decision to change to a more progressive course. Many other faiths like Methodists, Episcopalians, and the ELCA Lutherans also trended left. The main LDS Church so far voted to remain on a more conservative course, like many Roman Catholic churches, Eastern Orthodox churches, and evangelicals. Some researcher will be carefully looking at the results of these decisions in the next century. A few years ago, I attended the Sunday services of our friends in the Community of Christ, where one of the 70s was attending. I got to speak with him after the service, and I noted some concern that there was not really many people there, and there was one of the youngest people in the congregation. He very calmly noted that Jesus started with only 12, and that was sufficient. Well, We shall see. As always, the future belongs to those who show up. That's my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to chat with you.
Thank you so much, Brian. This has been very thought-provoking and interesting to me. We have several questions. Some of them I think you've already addressed, but maybe you want to just, if you have one that you've already addressed, just refresh our minds on the answer to that, and if you want to elaborate, that would be great. The first question I wanted to ask was, this one says, do you have any thoughts or predictions regarding the effects of COVID-19 on church activity rates? Was Elder Bednar's address lamenting that inability to meet a sign that the brethren are worried?
Oh, I'm sure they are worried, but I don't think they are alone in that concern. I think the biggest danger is people discover that they don't need church. I have a son who has been inactive for a long time, but he's agreed to bless the sacrament literally every week since then, which my wife is not happy to go back to church because he doesn't want to go. I don't have any numbers on that kind of force acting. That's going to be fascinating. I think, assuming we go back to church sometime within the next couple of months, there should be a very fascinating report in Sunstone 2021 on how that went across the church. Still too early to tell.
Yeah. Very interesting. This question asks, a lot of Mormons just slip away from activity in the church. How can statistics on that ghost group be gathered accurately? Does the church publish numbers around this very large percentage of members which are still on the rolls?
No, they definitely do not. I think it's because it's kind of embarrassing. And I think one of the other drivers of change in the church is that if you embarrass the church with your agitation, they tend to push back. And that's been seen in far too many instances in the last decade. I don't know of any way to gather those. There were surveys done in South America over religious identification over the last 10, 20 years, where the number of people that formally announced they were Mormon was way less than the reported numbers, meaning that these are people that still consider themselves Catholic or went once. They're Christmas and Easter Mormons, but they're Catholic the rest of the year. There's no good way to do this. This was a problem when I was a ward clerk, when we were trying to well, I want a count of all the inactive people in the ward. Like, they're not coming. I mean, they're not showing up. We have this number, but if they're particularly part-member families, their names are not going to be on the roll. This is a difficult problem. I imagine the statistics department has some answers, but I wouldn't know what they are nor how to find those answers.
Yeah, that's an interesting calling to have. Very interesting calling. You see a lot of different trends.
Yeah.
This question asks, there's obviously membership discrepancies. How might the church go about reconciling the numbers to be more reflective of actual attendance?
Yeah, I don't know how they will do that. The one big challenge is that some of the discrepancies I've seen in the numbers are probably a result of trying to make the numbers not look bad. I can't verify this, obviously, but how could they change? They could re-release the numbers from years before and talk about it openly, but that doesn't tend to be their way. I think they would say that they are interested in individual salvation and that the numbers aren't as important, but I'm pretty confident that internally they're extremely concerned about that and know that that releasing true sacrament meeting attendance numbers would be really depressing or shocking to many active members of the church.
Yeah, this question also goes along with that. It just says, how do you factor in the people disappeared into the address unknown files that don't appear on ward lists?
Yeah, I think the question almost answers itself. They disappear. We don't know. I knew the number of the people and the activity rate in my ward here in Gilbert, Arizona. It was about 60-70% at the time. But I knew that we had names that would come across to help find people who were missing, and we didn't have any control over that. There may be a large ward called the Unknown First Ward, which has 10 million members in it.
This one says, given that an active LDS Church member participates weekly, Whereas most religious people may attend monthly or even quarterly. Would you change any of your conclusions?
That is a great question. I had not thought of that. I would happily change those. I can tell you that the definition of an active member of the church is that they attended one time during the month of quarter end. So March, June, September, December. If you attend one sacrament meeting, you're classified as active by the LDS Church. So you could just attend 4 times a year and technically classified as active. That is factored in a bit, but at the same time, we also don't have the week-to-week aggregate total numbers of people attending sacrament meeting. Not that they could have done them in the last 4 months anyway.
Oh, I know there were a couple of good questions on there, but my phone is frozen. Let me see if I can get that up here on my computer.
Let me go over to another computer and see if I can pull it out myself.
Yeah. You might be able to do it faster than I am.
So one question is asking about the fact that women do not hold important callings in the church to cause a problem in priesthood, in leadership, if they don't actually need women in the pews for things to function. Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the most transformative things they could do, honestly, is to, if not full ordination of women, at least go back to the 1800s where they allowed women to give each other priesthood blessings, particularly for childbirth. Can you imagine how transformative that would be if they announced even just, okay, women, you have the authority to bless your own children, and women that you visit teach. There would be this massive rainbow colored party at Sunstone the next year, I'm certain. I think they would, they say a lot of nice things about involving women, but I think they are leaving their potential aside far too often. Everyone's allowed to pray, but if they told women you can and should put hands on head just for basic blessings of health, that would be one advantage they give them. Not pulling women into leadership, we can see the Episcopalians and many other churches, for example, doing that. And the question is that going to change the growth of the church if they were go down that path also? And which is why I left off in my conclusion that I don't know how this is going to proceed. That we've seen some declines in some of the more liberal churches, but I don't know how that would distinctly affect the LDS Church.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question. I'm excited to see what the liberalization of some of these churches will portend for the future. It's very interesting.
Yeah. The future is going to come whether or not they plan for it. So we'll see what they come up with.
Thank you. Do you have any closing thoughts for us?
Oh, I think I've talked enough. And if anyone wants to contact me on Whova or any other way, they're welcome to do so. Thank you very much for letting me present, and we'll see you at the next session.
Appreciate your time, and thank you everyone who's attended. And thank you very much for coming to Sunstone and for your support. With that, I will end the session.